What I just wanted to do essentially is speak a little bit from a monitoring and evaluation perspective. I have not been in social enterprises or part of social enterprises or worked necessarily directly with investors on this idea of how can you incorporate potentially social impact into your goals of either for-profit or non-for-profit. But of course, I am part of the development space. So what I thought I would quickly talk about is three main questions. What is social impact? How do we measure it well? And then why do we need evaluations? And how do we do good evaluations for social impact? Social impact evaluations, essentially. Now, before I go into that, I've been getting my head around, so things like the social stock exchange, I know development impact bonds, and I've sort of loosely been, reading up about them as well. As I was reading into this space, I also thought I would mention social impact can also be achieved not just through having a specific social impact goal. That is sort of, the social enterprise, the CSR, angle. A lot of what actually UNICEF does around the world is making sure that in their normal value chains that outcomes for children, for example, are addressed in normal processes, policies, and standards that businesses do. So I just wanted to make a distinction that just because it's not a specific goal, I think doesn't mean that we can't contribute to it as a whole sector, right? In the profit sector, the for-profit sector especially. And I think that that's just worth considering because we can get at social impact in different ways. To sort of move on to then what is social impact, I think that's whether it's businesses or development actors or government, when we think from what we're trying to do, the first thing is really trying to establish what is really the end goal of the investment that we make and how will it be achieved. This has to go beyond the inputs and the outputs, right? So it's beyond how many children have received school books, which might be a metric that, I guess a lot of CSR investment or even social enterprises might report back on. This is how many children receive school books. Easy to measure. It's very easy to report and also very easy to sell. But what does it actually mean, right? So I think it's pushing that envelope a little bit further beyond just the outputs and the immediate outcomes. What does that actually mean for a child to receive books? Do their learning levels increase as a result of learning levels? Do they actually stay in school? Are they skilled? Do they get a job, etc.? So we have to think of it as a continuum. We then also face a particular challenge, I think, when we talk about social impact, because it's real social impact is actually very complex and it takes time. And one of the examples that I want to mention, and it's really from the development sector side, but I wanted to mention it because it's a really important topic for us, and it's really difficult to understand how we can move the needle on this, is ending child marriage. So ending child marriage in India is extremely complex. We know it requires multiple strategies, including girls go to school, that they're essentially empowered to make life decisions. But it also means changing general social and gender norms of the community, of the household. These are all barriers that at the moment mean that, unfortunately, a lot of girls are getting married. And to add to that complexity, so it's not just one strategy, it's multiple strategies. And to add to that complexity, what works in one area or for one community doesn't necessarily work for a different area or a different community. And that's where really, when you start looking at it from a relevance, so what works for whom, and an equity perspective, right? Who are those that are really being left out because you are not doing the right thing? So if that's the complex sort of situation and issue that you're thinking about, because that is social impact, that's how we improve the lives, for example, of adolescent girls in India. How do you measure that, right? We can't just have a story from the field, this worked. We need to be able to measure it across the results chain, down the chain, as well as really well. We need really good measurements. And this links to the second piece that I was going to say, the point that I said, it takes time. So social impact does not happen in 3 years, in 5 years, even 10 years, it happens in decades. We know from looking at the life cycle approach that what happens to a child in their early development influences actually, for example, how they learn when they are teenagers, right? So a lot happens in the developmental years that ultimately affects what their outcomes will be 10, 15 years down the line. And I think that's a real challenge, not just for businesses and investors, it's also for the public sector, honestly, and for policymakers, because we don't tend to think that far in advance, right? So there's sort of, if I don't see a return on investment annually on what you're saying you're addressing as the problem, as the ultimate goal, maybe I'll wait a year, maybe I'll wait 3 years, but after that, I don't think this is worth my while. I'm not seeing the reported return on investment on that. And that's a question, I think, of sustainability. And then I think a point related to that is if we cannot measure it. So there's some things around social impact that are really, really difficult to measure. I'll take, actually, there's 2 examples, but the ones that we face are related to child protection. Trying to get an accurate measurement of violence against children or even child labor, it's slightly easier, but even then is very difficult. And to be able to do that well, to be able to do that ethically, means that we need to invest a lot of resources. And sometimes, honestly, we simply can't do it for certain populations in certain areas. Just because we can't measure it doesn't mean we shouldn't try investing in solving the problem and creating that social impact, right? It's still a very important issue. And I think traditionally, if you think about development as a space, that is often where you get your sort of nonprofits, your sort of, development donors coming in, because that is not something that essentially a for-profit would necessarily invest in, because it's just very difficult to define. And, to your investors, what did you actually achieve by making those investments? And then the sort of final point I'll talk a little bit about, because that speaks to the heart of me as an evaluator and my career. Even if we measure an outcome that we want to, and even if it's possible to do that on an annual basis, for example, because that's what we want to return back to our investors, how do we actually prove that your investment made the difference, right? How do we prove that the money, the inputs, whether it's money or whether it's resources, whatever it is, actually helped achieve that change? You could, for example, be supporting a job platform for young people. You could connect them to employment opportunities. But if youth employment rates increase, for example, is it because because a firm or a group of people or whoever it is invested in that platform? Or could it also be because generally the economy is improving, perhaps generally education levels are improving, income levels are improving? So there's the issue of contribution there. And I think that is where often we get stuck when it comes to social impact, because the moment we think about how complex social impact is to achieve, how it takes time, and then how many other factors would need to be right to be able to achieve that, is very difficult to say that the $1 that I have spent on X is translating to so many girls who are not getting married, or so many jobs for young people, right? And so I think for complex issues, it's difficult because you need multiple strategies, and investing in one is not sufficient, but investing in multiple becomes difficult to measure. And so I wanted to sort of end a little bit with speaking from my strength, a little bit from being an evaluator. And that last question on how do you do good social impact, right? Everything I've talked to you about is really about thinking about evaluative thinking, right? How do we get from the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, complexity, contribution, etc. And how do you measure it well? So how do we, at least in the development sector, in the sector that I've worked in, actually do good evaluations of social impact? So the first thing is we start with a very strong theory of change and results frameworks. I also think it's worth thinking about different evaluation designs or approaches over a longer period of time, because one of the things I was saying is it takes a longer period of time often to achieve social impact. So you can start with sort of design, what we would call design evaluations, design reviews, really at the initial stage. Do we think that, our theory of change results frameworks are robust? Do we think this has the largest chance of success? Formative evaluations through the course of the solution, essentially, that you're investing in, and then summative at the end. It's about course correction, learning, and accountability. And then I think there's also something to be said for adhering to the standards, accountability, transparency. All of these standards around evaluation is at a minimum what we need to adhere to make sure that it's credible. So follow some standard key norms, some standardized key norms and standards for the whole development space. And I'm going to plug here the framework that we usually use as the UN as a whole, and it's something that you can consider also more broadly beyond just the UN. But we use the OECD DAC criteria to do a lot of our evaluations around social impact. And the important thing here is that it doesn't only evaluate effectiveness, which is, are you getting results, essentially, which is an obvious one. It doesn't only evaluate efficiency, or are you getting, I guess, the return on what you wanted, and between different solutions, which one's the best value for money, best investment. It also speaks to relevance. So what does it mean? Are we doing the right thing for the right people? And I mentioned that before. There are different needs for different people, communities, areas, and the lower down the grassroots you go, the more specialized it might be, the most individual it might be. Coherence, how well is it aligned to what others are doing in this space? I don't have to duplicate, right? So how can I add to? And finally, sustainability, thinking of the long-term perspective. Essentially, we don't always have to use experimental, quasi-experimental designs. They are very good for establishing contribution, but we can also use things like theory tracing that is responding to the theory of change that was set out before. I think also really think about the participatory nature, because impact for who, right? What does it mean actually? And if we're too high in the sky and we lose the perspective of what it actually means to the lives of the people that we're trying to impact, I think then we've lost actually the power of an evaluation in and of itself to be able to remind us of that. So I think it's also really important, as we think of evaluations more generally around social impact, that we capture the voices of the different stakeholders. And of course, that also tells a good story. So I think I'll stop there.